She heard her fiancé's betrayal right before the wedding. Instead of running away in tears, she decided to do something different. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching this video from. The soft morning light filtered through the high stained glass windows of St. Augustine Church, casting colorful patterns on the polished wooden floor. The scent of fresh roses and lavender lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of incense from the morning mass. The grand hall, adorned with white silk drapery and golden accents, stood in hushed anticipation. In the bridal suite, the air was warm with excitement, the room bustling with the muted chaos of last-minute preparations. Jessica sat before an ornate mirror, her reflection both familiar and foreign. The lace of her wedding gown hugged her shoulders delicately, and the satin skirt pooled around her like a cloud. Her hair, a cascade of dark, glossy waves, was pinned back with pearl-studded combs. A soft veil, barely translucent, rested against her shoulders, ready to be drawn over her face. But beneath the surface of elegance, her chest was tight with something she couldn't name. An unease, a whisper in the back of her mind that refused to be silenced. Her mother, Florence, fussed over the hem of the gown, smoothing it with careful fingers, her lips pursed in concentration. "Look at you," she said, straightening up and placing a warm hand on Jessica's arm. "You're the most beautiful bride I've ever seen." Jessica smiled, but it felt tight. She met her mother's eyes in the mirror, eyes that mirrored her own, deep, expressive, and holding generations of strength. "Thank you, Mama," she replied softly. Her voice sounded distant, as though she were hearing it through water. The door opened, and her father, James, stepped in, his towering figure softening with a smile that creased the corners of his eyes. In his hands was a small, worn velvet box. "I have something for you," he said, his voice deep and rich, the voice that had read her bedtime stories and offered advice through every heartbreak. Jessica turned to face him, and he opened the box to reveal a simple gold locket, aged but polished to a warm shine. "This belonged to your grandmother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She wore it on her wedding day. It carries our family's love and strength. Now it's yours." Jessica felt her throat tighten as he clasped the locket around her neck. It rested against her skin, cool and comforting, a tether to her roots. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. "I'll cherish it." Her father cupped her face briefly, his calloused thumb brushing her cheek with the tenderness only a father could give. "I am so proud of you," he said softly. The moment felt perfect almost, and yet the strange tightness in her chest remained. A familiar voice broke the silence. "What's this? A family moment without me?" Monica's playful lilt filled the room as she stepped in, her figure resplendent in a sleek bridesmaid's gown. Monica, Jessica's cousin and lifelong confidant, brought with her an energy that could lift even the heaviest heart. Her eyes, however, sharpened as she took in Jessica's expression. "You okay, Jess?" Jessica's lips parted automatically to answer, but something in Monica's gaze made her pause. I'm fine," she said, though the words felt hollow. Monica didn't press, but gave her a look that said she wasn't convinced. "You've got this," she said simply, reaching out to squeeze Jessica's hand. As the final touches were applied, lip gloss smoothed, veil adjusted, bouquet placed in her trembling fingers. Jessica's heart should have soared, but when she looked at herself in the mirror, she felt something strange, a sudden, inexplicable dissonance, as if the woman staring back wasn't her at all, but a stranger in borrowed dreams. A sharp knock on the door startled her. It was the wedding planner, peeking in with a bright, professional smile. 5 minutes, everyone." The energy in the room shifted. Laughter, nerves, excitement. Her mother kissed her forehead. "It's time, sweetheart." Jessica nodded, the motion mechanical. "It's time," she echoed, but inside her heart whispered, "Is it?" As she stepped into the hallway, her heels clicking softly on the polished stone floor, the distant strains of the wedding processional reached her ears. She paused, her pulse quickening for reasons she couldn't define. Ahead, through the frosted glass doors, she glimpsed the main hall where guests were gathering. To the left, the corridor stretched toward the groom's suite, and there, through the barely cracked door, she heard it. Her name. Jessica's breath caught. She wasn't eavesdropping, at least she hadn't meant to, but the familiarity of her fiancé's voice, low and casual, and the unmistakable tone of his best man, Tom, made her footsteps falter. Something about the cadence, the humor laced with something sharp, prickled at her skin. She told herself to walk on. She should be in position by now, but her body disobeyed, her feet rooted to the spot just outside the slightly ajar door. "Man, you're really going through with it," came Tom's voice, laced with amusement. Andrew's answer was light, flippant. "Of course. It's just one day, then smooth sailing." Tom chuckled. "One day? You're marrying her." Jessica's heart gave a stutter, and something cold curled in her stomach. Andrew's voice, familiar and yet foreign in its callousness, responded, "Yeah, well, marriage is a means to an end." Jessica's skin went cold. The bouquet trembled in her hands, and her throat dried as the world tilted on its axis. But it wasn't until Andrew continued, his voice laced with something sharp and cruel, that her heart began to crack, line by painful line. She pressed her back against the wall, her breath shallow, her body frozen by the weight of his words. The edges of her vision blurred, but her hearing sharpened, catching every syllable as if they were carved into her soul. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The warmth, the love, the dreams, they didn't shatter. They burned, turning to something fierce and raw. And though her knees threatened to buckle, her heart did something else. It began to harden. The music swelled beyond the doors. The guests waited. The vows lay unspoken. But Jessica's world had already changed forever, and she had yet to decide what to do next. The muffled notes of the string quartet drifted down the corridor, weaving through the heavy silence that surrounded Jessica. The soft murmur of guests and the distant laughter from the reception area felt surreal, like echoes from another world, a world she no longer belonged to. Her heart pounded so fiercely she feared it would betray her presence, a trembling drumbeat against her ribcage. The door to the groom's suite stood slightly ajar, a crack of warm light spilling into the dim hallway. Beyond it, Andrew's voice, so familiar, so beloved, carried through the narrow space. She should have turned away. She should have left, joined the bridal procession, and walked down the aisle to meet him. But she didn't move. She couldn't. She had heard her name. It was the casual, dismissive way he said it that froze her in place. "Man, you're really going through with it," came Tom's voice, laced with amusement and disbelief. Tom, Andrew's best friend and best man, always wore a smirk as though everything in life were a joke. Jessica had never fully trusted him. Now she felt the cold weight of that intuition tightening around her chest. Andrew's voice followed, smooth, but edged with something she couldn't place. "Of course, it's just one day. After that, it's business as usual." Jessica's fingers tightened around the satin-wrapped stems of her bouquet, the soft petals bruising under the pressure. Her breath halted, her ears straining. "Just one day?" Tom chuckled softly. "One day? You're getting married. That's a lifetime." A beat of silence. Then Andrew's answer, light, flippant, but cutting through her skin like glass. "Marriage is a means to an end." Jessica felt the air leave her body. A hollow, icy ache unfurled inside her chest. She pressed her back against the cool stone wall, her knees weak, her stomach a leaden knot. She must have misheard. She had to. Tom's voice, with its ever-present smirk, filled the silence. "Come on, man. You've been playing the devoted fiancé for 2 years. What's the angle here?" Andrew's laugh was low, smug, and cruelly intimate. The laugh he reserved for conversations Jessica was never meant to hear. "It's about perception. You know how my boss is. Always preaching about diversity and community outreach. Marrying her?" He gave a short, humorless chuckle. "It's a power move. Makes me look progressive. Like I care about all that inclusion crap he's always spouting." The blood drained from Jessica's face so quickly that the room tilted. She felt her heart crack, splintering into sharp edges that tore through her chest. The fingers around her bouquet trembled violently. Her mind screamed at her to stop listening, to walk away, but her body stayed frozen, pinned by the horror of his words. Tom laughed, a sharp bark of amusement. "So the wedding's just PR?" Andrew didn't even hesitate. "Exactly. It's good optics. People love that shit. Interracial couple, big charity donations, all that feel-good garbage. My boss eats it up. And once the wedding pictures are out there, I'll be the golden boy at the firm. Promotions, partnerships, it's all lined up." Jessica's knees buckled, and she barely caught herself against the wall, her hand pressed flat to the cold surface as if it could hold her together. Her pulse throbbed in her ears, drowning out the music, the voices, everything but his next words. "And her family?" Tom's voice dripped with disdain. "You ready for all that drama?" Andrew sighed, his voice turning hard, stripped of the false warmth she had once believed in. "I'll deal with them. Her mom's sweet but clueless, and her dad, honestly, the man can barely hold a conversation in proper English without tripping over his accent. Embarrassing. Once we're married, I'll keep them at arm's length. Maybe throw some cash their way to keep them out of our business. Trust me, they'll take it. They always do." A burning rush of fury surged up Jessica's throat so quickly she nearly choked on it. She felt her breath shuddering, her body vibrating with shock and rage. Her father, who had worked 2 jobs to put her through college, who had crossed an ocean and built a life from nothing, reduced to an inconvenience. Her mother, who had opened their home and heart to Andrew, cooking him meals from their family's traditions, mocked and discarded as if she were nothing. Tom gave an ugly little snicker. "Damn, cold, man. And Jess? She really doesn't suspect a thing?" "She's naive," Andrew said, and his voice, God, his voice, was so casual, so confident, that it felt like a knife twisting. "She actually believes I'm in love with her. It's almost sweet. But hey, she gets the ring and the big wedding. Isn't that what every girl wants?" Tom laughed darkly. "Better you than me. I don't think I could handle all that baggage." Andrew's voice dropped lower, almost conspiratorial. "Yeah, well, it's a trade-off. She'll fall in line, and if she doesn't, she'll learn. Once we're hitched, it's my rules. She wanted this, didn't she? A husband, a house, a future. So she gets me. All of me. The rest, irrelevant." Jessica felt something inside her shatter. A fragile, precious thing. Her trust, her dreams, her love was ground into dust under the weight of his words. Her body felt both burning and numb, her hands trembling so violently that her bouquet slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft, defeated thud. Her vision blurred, tears burning hot trails down her cheeks. She pressed her palm to her lips to stifle the broken sound that threatened to escape. She felt sick, physically, violently ill, but her legs wouldn't move. She wanted to scream, to confront, to tear the door from its hinges and demand to know how he could do this to her, how he could say those things about her family, the people who had welcomed him with open arms. But she didn't move. She couldn't. She was frozen, pinned to the spot by the cold, merciless weight of betrayal. The voices beyond the door continued, their laughter sharp and hollow, but Jessica no longer heard the words. The echo of his cruelty was already seared into her skin, a scar that would never fade. The music beyond the corridor swelled, a signal that the ceremony was about to begin. The guests waited. Her parents waited. Her future, what she thought was her future, stood on the other side of those doors, wrapped in lies and cruelty. But Jessica no longer felt like a bride. She felt like a fool, a pawn in a game she hadn't known she was playing. And as the veil of illusion fell away, something new emerged from the wreckage. Not just heartbreak, but rage, cold, sharp, and righteous. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she fought to steady herself. Her body was shaken, her mind racing, but beneath the agony, something in her heart, something vital, was crystallizing into steel. Her wedding day was ruined, but the day was not over, and neither was she. Jessica stumbled away from the door, her heels clicking unevenly on the cold marble floor. She barely felt the ache in her ankles or the sting of the broken stems from her fallen bouquet. Her world had folded in on itself, the ceiling pressing down, the air thick and choking. The corridor, lined with antique sconces casting a warm glow, felt endless and suffocating all at once. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her body moved on instinct, her vision blurred by tears that refused to fall freely. She found herself in a small side room, a dusty, forgotten space meant for prayer or reflection. Sunlight streamed through a narrow stained glass window, casting fragmented colors on the stone floor. Jessica collapsed into a wooden chair, her chest heaving, her hands trembling violently in her lap. Her heart pounded with a chaotic rhythm, crashing against her ribs. The silence around her was deafening, but inside her head, Andrew's words replayed, each one a fresh wound slashed across her soul. Marriage is a means to an end. Good optics. She's naive. Her family's an embarrassment. A strangled, gasping sound escaped her lips, a sob, or perhaps something closer to a scream. She clamped her hand over her mouth, her body shaken as the weight of it all crushed down on her. The man she loved, the man she had trusted, the man she had dreamed of building a life with. He didn't love her. He never had. She was a trophy, a prop, a convenient symbol for his ambition. And her family, the people who had welcomed him into their lives with warmth and kindness, reduced to nothing more than an obstacle in his social climb. Jessica's stomach twisted painfully, and for a wild, desperate moment, she thought she might vomit. Her body rejected the cruelty she had absorbed. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, her palms pressed hard against her temples as if she could physically crush the memories out of her mind. She felt like she was breaking, splintering into pieces too jagged to ever fit back together. But through the chaos of her grief, through the burning, blistering ache in her chest, a new feeling began to rise, hot and sharp, searing through the numbness. Rage. A sound, low and raw, rumbled in her throat. It tasted bitter, tasted like blood. She squeezed her eyes shut, her teeth gritting so tightly her jaw ached. Her fingers curled into fists, nails digging painfully into her palms. How dare he? How dare he use her? How dare he stand beside her family, eat at their table, smile at their stories while secretly scorning them? How dare he steal the love she had so freely, so fully given and twisted into a ladder for his career? The door creaked, and she snapped her head up, every muscle taut and ready to shatter at the slightest push. Monica stood in the doorway, her face flushed with worry, her voice soft but urgent. "Jess, what the hell? What's wrong?" The moment she saw Jessica's face, blotchy with withheld tears, lips trembling, eyes wild, Monica's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. She stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind her. Jessica's voice broke as she spoke, her words jagged and raw. I heard him. Monica, I heard everything." Monica was at her side in an instant, her hands firm on Jessica's shoulders. "What did you hear?" she demanded, her voice steady but tight with protective fire. Jessica's throat closed, and for a moment she couldn't force the words out. They felt too large, too monstrous to fit through her lips. But the weight was unbearable, and it came out in a hoarse, shaking whisper. "He doesn't love me. He never did. He's marrying me for his career, for optics." Her voice cracked, and her face twisted in anguish. "And Monica, he said awful things about Mama, about Dad. He called them—" She couldn't finish. The words burned too much. Monica froze, and for a breathless moment, the room seemed to vibrate with her silence. Then her hands fell away, and a cold, sharp fury hardened her face. "That piece of—" Jessica's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like a blade. "He thinks I'm naive. He thinks I'll just go through with it." Monica's nostrils flared, her body taut with barely restrained rage. He what?" She was already moving, already turning toward the door as if she would storm the groom's suite and tear him apart with her bare hands. "I swear to God, Jessica, I'll—" Jessica's voice, low and raw, stopped her in her tracks. "No." Monica turned back, her eyes blazing. "No?" Jessica stood, her legs unsteady but her spine straight. The tears that streaked her cheeks glistened in the fractured light from the window, but her eyes were something else entirely. The fire inside them could have set the entire church ablaze. "I'm not running. I'm not hiding. He thinks I'll just swallow this, that I'll marry him because I'm too afraid to cause a scene, because I'm too weak." Her fists trembled at her sides. "But I won't. I won't." Monica's eyes narrowed, her voice sharpening. "So what's the plan?" Jessica's chest heaved with the force of her breath. "He used me," she said, her voice low and cold, "used my love, used my family, and he thinks he's going to win." Her hands unclenched, her fingers steady now. "No, not today." Monica's lips curled into something between a snarl and a smirk. "Damn right." The air between them seemed to crackle, an unspoken vow passing from one woman to another. Then Jessica's voice dropped, her gaze hard and fixed on the door, as if she could already see Andrew beyond it. "But if I'm going to burn this down, I want everyone to see the flames." Monica's brow lifted slowly, and something dangerous flashed in her eyes. "You want to take him down?" she said softly, her voice electric with approval. "Let's take him down." Jessica's eyes didn't waver. "I want them to hear him, the way I did. I want the whole damn room to know exactly who he is. No excuses, no lies." Monica's smirk sharpened into something fierce. "You want receipts," she said, pulling her phone from the pocket of her dress. "Then let's get them." The roar of her pulse slowed in Jessica's ears, her breaths no longer jagged but measured. The tears had stopped falling. She felt hollowed out, scraped raw from the inside, but in the empty space where love had been, something else now burned, hotter, brighter, and far more dangerous. Resolve. Andrew had stripped her of her illusions. He had broken something sacred, but he had made one critical mistake. He thought she would be silent. But Jessica had found her voice. And before the day was over, the world would hear it too. The door to the small room closed behind them with a soft click, leaving Jessica and Monica in the cocoon of charged silence. The air was thick with tension, but under it, a current of something colder, sharper, purpose. The raw edge of Jessica's grief had not dulled, but it had hardened, crystallizing into something else entirely. Jessica's voice was low, steady, but every word felt like it was pulled from the marrow of her bones. He thinks I'm a fool. He thinks he's already won. Monica, standing beside her, the glow of her phone screen casting a pale light across her face, gave a slow, dangerous smile. Then, let's show him what it feels like to lose. Jessica's eyes met hers, and no words were needed. The plan had already formed between them, forged from the wreckage of betrayal and bound by something far stronger than revenge. Justice. We need his words, Jessica said, her voice like iron. Not just what I heard. I want him to confirm it. On record. Monica's fingers tapped swiftly on her phone, adjusting settings. Voice recorders ready, she said, holding up the screen where the app blinked to life. Now, how do we make him talk? Jessica's hands, still trembling from the confrontation with her own shattered heart, curled into fists before she let out a slow breath. He thinks I'm gone, she said slowly, the beginnings of an idea blooming through the haze of her pain. He'll be rattled. I want to use that. A pause. Then Monica's eyes sharpened, catching onto the glint in Jessica's. You want me to go to him? Jessica nodded. You're my cousin. He won't suspect you. Tell him you're worried. Say I ran out, that I'm upset, but don't tell him why. Monica's lips curled with something cold and delighted. You want him to explain himself. Exactly, Jessica said, her voice tight but clear. He'll try to control the narrative. He'll downplay it, but he won't be able to resist showing his true colors. If we push him just right, he'll prove what he is. Monica's fingers tightened around the phone. Got it. And when he slips, we'll have everything, Jessica said, her eyes blazing. And then everyone will know. Monica found him exactly where she expected, pacing in the front corridor of the church, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. The tension in his shoulders, the sharp flick of his gaze toward the church doors, everything screamed frustration and barely contained panic. Andrew, she called, letting her voice carry a tremor of concern as she approached. He turned sharply, his expression briefly cracking with surprise before he smoothed it over into something resembling composed worry. Monica, where's Jessica? His voice was tight, clipped, and his eyes flicked behind her, searching. Monica clutched her phone tighter in her palm, careful to keep it hidden but recording. She swallowed and injected her voice with the perfect blend of urgency and confusion. I don't know. She ran off. She was upset. She wouldn't say why. Andrew's lips pressed into a thin line. Ran off? He echoed, his jaw flexing. His gaze darted around, his mind clearly racing. Did she... He paused, then changed his angle. Did she say anything to you? Monica gave him a worried, uncertain look. She kept saying something about not being the bride you wanted. About your family not liking her. I tried to talk to her, but she let her voice break just a fraction. She's so upset. Andrew's face tightened, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, not concern. Jesus, he muttered under his breath, dragging a hand down his face. This is exactly what I didn't need. Monica stepped closer, lowering her voice, her eyes wide with false sympathy. "Andrew, what's going on? What did you say to her?" He hesitated, his mask slipping further. "It's complicated," he said tightly. "She's overreacting." "Overreacting to what?" Monica pressed, her voice sharp with concern. "She's about to walk down the aisle and she's crying, 'Andrew, what did you do?'" Andrew's control cracked, and the arrogance that always lurked beneath his polished charm spilled out. His voice lowered, clipped and edged with irritation. "Look," he said coldly, "I didn't do anything to her. She's just emotional. She always is." Monica's fingers twitched against her phone, but she kept her expression tight with worry. "Then why would she say that you don't want her, that she isn't right for you?" Andrew's laugh was short and cold. "Because she's insecure," he snapped. "She's always been insecure about us, about what people think." His tone sharpened with condescension. "Honestly, I knew she'd get cold feet. This is typical Jess." Monica's lips pressed together, her stomach burning with disgust. "Andrew," she said, her voice carefully weighted with hesitant confusion, "if you really love her, why does she feel like you don't?" Andrew's eyes narrowed slightly, and something colder slithered into his voice. "Because she expects me to coddle her insecurities," he said bluntly. "But the truth?" He let out a sharp breath through his nose. "I'm marrying her because it's the smart thing to do." Monica's heart pounded in her ears, but she kept her face frozen in a mask of cautious sympathy. "The smart thing?" she echoed softly. Andrew, clearly agitated and now venting without realizing the danger, continued, his voice low and sharp. "Yeah, she's good for the image. You think my boss isn't going to love this whole inclusive, diverse fairy tale? Jessica's perfect for that. Makes me look like the progressive golden boy." Monica's grip on her phone turned to steel, the recording capturing every venomous syllable. "And what about her?" Monica asked, her voice cool now, testing him. "What does she get?" Andrew's smile was thin and humorless. "She gets me," he said simply, his tone dripping with smug arrogance. "She gets her big wedding, the fancy life. Hell, she should be grateful." Monica felt a cold fury burn through her veins, but she swallowed it, her voice tight and shaking with carefully crafted disbelief. "Grateful? For what?" Andrew's eyes flashed with something almost bored. "For the upgrade," he said bluntly. "Look, I've played my part. I've smiled at the family gatherings. I've eaten her mom's food." He wrinkled his nose slightly. "I've done all the things. And once we're married, I'll set the rules. She'll get used to it." Monica's stomach churned with disgust so sharp it felt like acid. She couldn't hold back the coldness in her voice any longer. "So, it's all just a transaction to you?" Andrew's lips curled slightly. "Aren't all marriages?" he said, and his voice was so utterly devoid of warmth, so poisoned with casual cruelty, that Monica felt her entire body coil with the urge to break him. But instead, she stepped back, her expression hardening with something cold and final. "You really don't love her," she said, her voice steady now. "Do you?" Andrew's eyes flicked, and for a second he seemed to sense the shift in the air. His expression tensed. "Of course I do," he said too quickly, his voice defensive. "What is this, an interrogation?" Monica's fingers hovered over her phone's screen, ready to end the recording. But she gave him one more chance, one last rope to hang himself. "Then why," she said, her voice like ice, "do you sound like you own her?" His mask cracked entirely then, and his voice, stripped of charm, was cutting and cold. "Because," he said, and in that single word there was no pretense left, only the truth. She belongs to me. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the echoes of his words. Monica's thumb hit stop. The recording saved, and in her eyes there was only fire. She found Jessica back in the small room where the light from the stained glass window bathed her in fractured colors. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line, but when she looked up and met Monica's gaze, the question was already there. Monica's hand, still gripping her phone tightly, trembled slightly as she held it up. "I got it," she said simply. Jessica reached for the phone with hands that shook, not from fear, but from something deeper, something forged in agony and transformed into resolve. She hit play. Andrew's voice filled the room. Every word he had said, every slur of arrogance, every drop of poison spilled from the speaker. His disdain, his cruelty, his lies. Jessica stood perfectly still, but with each sentence something inside her sharpened. Pain turned to steel, heartbreak to armor. When the recording ended, the silence was absolute. And then Jessica spoke, her voice soft but unbreakable. He thought I wouldn't hear him. Her fingers curled tightly around the phone, her knuckles white. "But now," she said, and her voice was cold as the edge of a blade, "the whole world will." The echoes of the string quartet's prelude drifted softly through the grand hall, but the air felt charged, buzzing with tension just beneath the polished surface of the ceremony. Guests sat expectantly, their whispers rising and falling like a tide. Rows of white roses adorned the pews, and soft candlelight flickered from golden sconces, casting a warm, sacred glow over the vaulted ceiling. But beneath the facade of celebration, something colder stirred. At the altar, Andrew stood, his hands clasped in front of him, his polished shoes planted firmly on the marble. His jaw was tight, and his eyes, calculating and sharp, flicked toward the entrance. The music was reaching its cue. The procession was due to begin, and Jessica was nowhere to be seen. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Ignoring the stares of the front row guests, he stepped aside, retrieving it. A text flashed from Monica. She needed a minute. "She's coming." Andrew's lips pressed into a thin line. His frustration, barely concealed beneath his composed exterior, sharpened into something colder. "Dramatic," he muttered under his breath, masking it with a tight smile as he felt the weight of the waiting crowd. His eyes scanned the pews, his colleagues, his boss, the influential figures he needed to impress, every one of them expecting the perfect union, the perfect image. He smoothed his jacket and turned back to the officiant, leaning in slightly. "Just give her another minute," he said with a carefully measured chuckle. "Nerves, you know." The officiant, Reverend Carter, a silver-haired man with a kindly face, gave a small, understanding nod. "It's a big day," he said. "We'll give her a moment." But the music was already swelling to its climax, and Jessica still hadn't appeared. The murmurs among the guests grew louder, curiosity turning to concern. Jessica's family shifted uneasily, confusion shadowing their faces. Her mother, Florence, clutched her husband James's hand tightly, her expression troubled. Monica had returned to her seat, her eyes flicking toward the side entrance, her lips pressed into a tense line. She knew what was coming. She had helped set the match to the fuse. The doors at the back of the church groaned suddenly as they opened, not to the bridal march, but to Jessica herself. She wasn't walking down the aisle. She was standing before it, alone. The music faltered, stuttering to a halt as the sudden break in tradition stunned the room into silence. Every head turned. Every whisper died. Jessica stood there, framed by the grand doors, the train of her wedding gown pooling around her feet like a banner. The pearl-studded veil hung forgotten over her back, and the locket, her grandmother's, rested above her heart, a silent shield. Her face, her face, was something no one expected. Not the glowing joy of a bride, not the nervous tremor of pre-wedding jitters. It was calm, but forged from something blistering and unbreakable. Andrew's mouth opened in confusion, his perfect mask slipping for the first time. "Jessica," he called, his voice uncertain, a thread of tension breaking through his charm. "Baby, what are you?" Her voice, clear and steady, cut through the vaulted air, stopping him cold. "We need to talk," she said. "Right now." The murmur swelled into a low hum of confusion. Florence half rose from her seat, her face creased with worry. "Jessica, honey, what's—" Jessica lifted a hand, her voice carrying, strong and unshaken. "Please, just listen." She stepped forward, the soft crush of satin against stone the only sound as she moved. She stopped at the edge of the aisle, the line between the life that was and the life that could never be. Her eyes found Andrew's, and in them he saw something that made his pulse falter. Not heartbreak, not sadness, but something far worse. Judgment. "You wanted an audience," she said, her voice ringing out into the hushed space. "You wanted everyone to see this wedding, to see us." Her lips, painted a perfect bridal pink, pressed into a line. "So let's show them everything." The crowd rippled with uncertainty, uneasy, shifting, but no one dared break the spell of her voice. Monica, from her seat, felt her heart pounding, but her hands steady. She gripped her phone tightly, the screen still cool from what it had captured. Andrew, his mask struggling to hold, stepped forward, his voice tight but layered with feigned confusion. "Jess," he said softly, though his voice carried, "I don't know what's wrong, but—" Her hand lifted again, sharp as a blade, silencing him. "Stop!" Her voice didn't tremble. "Let me speak." His eyes flicked to Monica, suspicion, hot and sharp, burning there, but it was too late. Jessica's voice, cold as iron, filled the space. "I heard you, Andrew." The church seemed to freeze, the air itself caught and held between the stone pillars. A heartbeat passed, then another. Andrew's smile, thin, tight, barely cracked his lips. "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice still wearing the coat of charm, but the seams were splitting. "Baby, I heard you." Jessica's voice was clear, each word striking like a hammer to glass. "I heard every word you said to Tom. I heard why you're marrying me, and I heard what you really think about me, about my family." A gasp, sharp and collective, rippled through the pews. Florence's hand clamped over her mouth. James's face, lined with years of labor and love, hardened with something terrible and cold. From the other side, Diane, Andrew's mother, stiffened, her lips pursing, her eyes darting to her son with the faintest flicker of alarm. And Andrew, his mask shattered, his polished smile cracked, his eyes flashing wide and sharp. "Jessica," he said, and now the charm was gone. Now it was warning. "I don't know what you think you heard, but—" She didn't let him finish, because from her hand, small, steady, merciless, came the sound that would end him. The click of a play button. The church was filled, not with Jessica's voice, but his, and in the damning silence the recording spoke for her. "I'm marrying her because it's the smart thing to do." The gasp from the crowd hit like a wave. "She's good for the image, makes me look like the progressive golden boy." A murmur, sharp with shock, swept through the pews. Andrew's face drained of color, his eyes darkening with panic. "Turn that off," he snapped, his voice cutting through the air, but it was too late. "She should be grateful. She gets me." The venom in his voice, cold and certain, filled every corner of the room. "Once we're married, I'll set the rules. She'll get used to it." A ripple of disgust, unmistakable and raw, coursed through the crowd. Someone gasped audibly. An elderly woman clutched her pearls. Andrew's colleagues exchanged shocked, cutting glances, and his boss, face cold and stone-hard, shifted in his seat with an expression that promised consequences. And then, the final blow. "She belongs to me." The recording ended with a hollow, terrible silence, but in the absence of sound, the damage roared. Jessica lowered the phone, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "This," she said, her voice slicing the silence, "is the man you came to celebrate. This is the man who stood beside me for 2 years, wearing a mask." She turned, her voice ringing out to every guest. "The man who said he loved me, who promised me forever, only to use me as a prop, as leverage." Her voice tightened and the steel beneath cracked, letting the pain, the heartbreak, show. "And worse, who insulted my family, the people who welcomed him, who loved him." Her voice fell, but it hit harder. "So, there will be no wedding today." The room seemed to exhale, but it was not relief, it was judgment, sharp and final. Andrew surged forward, his mask shattered completely now, his voice raw with anger. "Jessica, stop this!" he snapped, his voice a whip of desperation and rage. "You're ruining everything." Her eyes, dark and blazing, met his. "No," she said, her voice a death knell. "You ruined everything." His facade, so carefully crafted, collapsed fully then, and the man beneath was everything she had seen through the cracks. Bitter, selfish, small. "You don't get it," he hissed, his voice low but lethal. "You walk away from this and you lose. You'll be the runaway bride, you'll be humiliated, you'll—" Her voice cut through his, final and unbreakable. "I would rather stand alone in truth than be bound to you in lies." A stillness, a reckoning, and then applause, not hesitant, not awkward, but resounding. The first clap came from her father, James, his expression thunderous with pride. Then her mother, Florence, tears streaking her cheeks but her eyes bright with fierce love. Then Monica, her smile sharp and victorious. And the wave broke. Her friends, her family, even some of Andrew's colleagues, faces twisted in disgust, stood, their applause a verdict. Andrew, his face twisted in rage, turned, only to meet the cold, cutting stare of his boss. And in that look, he saw the future crumbling, the partnership, the promotion, the reputation, gone, all of it, gone, because Jessica had burned his house of lies and left him standing in ashes. Jessica turned from him then, away from the altar, away from the shattered dream. She walked down the aisle, but not as a bride, as something far more powerful. A woman who chose herself. And behind her, the ruin of everything Andrew had built. The thunder of applause still echoed in the vaulted ceilings of St. Augustine Church, but beneath it there was something sharper, a breaking. The clean, precise fracture of glass when it hits the ground. And Andrew was standing in the center of the wreckage. Jessica's footsteps had already faded, her gown's soft rustle disappearing beyond the heavy oak doors. But the ruin she left behind remained, raw and undeniable. The air, thick and burning from the weight of truth, pressed down on him. Every eye in the room was a dagger. Colleagues, friends, family, all watching the cracks in his perfect facade widen and collapse. A single word cut through the suffocating silence like a whip. Shameful. It was his mother, Diane. Her voice, always sharp but tempered in public, now carried the full weight of her fury. She stood, the cold disdain on her face unmistakable. "What have you done, Andrew?" Andrew's jaw clenched and the mask, the charm, the control, snapped back like a reflex. "It's not what it sounds like," he barked, his voice tight with anger and panic. His eyes flashed to the guests, his mind scrambling, calculating the damage. This is misunderstood, a personal disagreement. A misunderstanding?" Monica's voice, rich with cutting disbelief, sliced through the room. She rose from her seat, the phone still warm in her palm. "No, Andrew, that was you," loud and clear. Andrew's eyes, sharp with venom, turned to her. "You," he hissed, and for the first time the polished veneer cracked fully. "You recorded me?" Monica's lips curled in a smile as cold as winter steel. "Damn right I did." She stepped forward, her heels crisp on the marble, her voice carrying through the stunned pews. "Because people like you always lie when the mask is on. So I made sure everyone heard you without it." A low murmur rolled through the crowd. Disgust, anger, disbelief. Whispers ignited like sparks in dry grass. "Did you hear what he said about her family? My God, he used her for his career? What a snake!" Andrew felt the heat rise, panic clawing up his throat. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "This is character assassination," he snapped, his voice tightening, sharp with desperation. His gaze shot toward his boss, Mr. Garrett, seated near the front. "Sir, this isn't what it seems." But Mr. Garrett, a man known for his calm and measured judgments, was already rising from his seat, his face set in stone. "It seems," he said slowly, his voice heavy with cold authority, "that I've just learned exactly who you are." Andrew's mouth opened and closed. His throat worked, but no words emerged. Garrett's eyes, hard as flint, pinned him in place. "I have no tolerance for opportunists who exploit people under the guise of inclusion. You've made it clear that you don't value the principles our company stands for." His voice, still low, carried to every corner of the room. "You're not just losing a promotion, Andrew. You're losing everything." The whispering in the pews swelled into a current of judgment, rippling through Andrew's carefully constructed world and dragging it under. His chest heaved with panicked breaths, his eyes burning with sudden, boiling rage. His mask shattered, and in its place emerged the man Jessica had unmasked, bitter, cruel, and cornered. His eyes flashed towards the side aisle, and there they were, James and Florence, Jessica's parents. James stood, his broad shoulders set, his hands folded tightly at his sides. His face was carved from granite, his jaw tense, his eyes burning with something ancient and cold. The protective fury of a father whose daughter had been wronged. But it was Florence who spoke first. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was soft, but heavy with the weight of heartbreak. "You sat at our table," she said, each word slow, measured, laced with the ache of betrayal. "You looked into my eyes, into my husband's eyes, and you lied." James, his voice low and trembling with restrained wrath, added, "You smiled at my daughter. You asked for her hand. And all the while, you—" He stopped, his voice choked with disgust. "You mocked us." Andrew's face twisted, his control snapping. "Oh, please," he snapped, his voice venomous now, the mask fully gone. "Don't act so righteous." His gaze, cold and cruel, pinned Florence. You wanted me to marry her. You wanted a husband with my connections. You needed me." The gasp that echoed through the room was sharp and furious. But Florence didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, closer than anyone dared, and she looked him in the eye. "We needed nothing from you," she said, her voice unwavering. "Jessica loved you. We loved you because she chose you, and you have disgraced that love." Her eyes, glistening but fierce, narrowed. "You think your money, your name, your career makes you more? Makes you better than us?" She shook her head slowly. "No, it makes you less." Andrew's lips curled, a flash of something ugly and bitter rising to the surface. "Oh, spare me." His voice dripped with unveiled cruelty now. "You're nothing but—" He stopped, or rather he was stopped, by a voice he hadn't expected, a voice low, deep, and carved from stone. "James." "If you finish that sentence," James said, his voice deadly soft, "it will be the last thing you say today." And the room, silent, breathless, felt the weight of that promise. The air crackled, an instant suspended between explosion and restraint, and Andrew, for all his venom, looked into the furnace of James's eyes that had worked, fought, and bled for his family, and he did what cowards do when faced with a man made of iron. He shut his mouth, but the silence didn't save him, because it was filled by something worse. Laughter, soft, cutting, and utterly without warmth. Monica, her eyes burning with cold satisfaction, spoke. "You thought you could play the perfect fiancé, thought Jess would just fold under the pressure, thought we would stay silent." She leaned in slightly, her voice like a blade pressed against his throat. "Big mistake." Andrew's voice, sharp with rising panic, cracked. You're ruining me." Monica's smile, wide and merciless, flashed. "No, sweetie, you ruined yourself." Her eyes flicked around the room, the silent, judging faces. "We just gave you the microphone." The sound of heels echoed once more, a familiar rhythm, but it wasn't Jessica returning. It was Diane, his mother. Her heels stopped short, directly before him, and when he looked into her face, the sharp, disapproving line of her mouth, the one he had grown up fearing, was cold. "You've disgraced me," she said, her voice slicing clean and cold through the thickened air. "You've disgraced this family." His voice, tight and desperate, cracked. "Mom," but she raised a hand, and his words died. "No," she said, her voice quiet but hard as steel. "You will not use my name to shield your shame." She turned then, to the guests, to everyone, her voice clear and final. "This man is no son of mine." The room, already heavy with condemnation, froze. And then, as Diane turned her back on him, Andrew felt the world collapse. He felt it. In the cold, distant turn of his boss's face. In the scorched silence from colleagues he had once called friends. In the sharp, final gaze from Monica as she pocketed the recording. His ruin, preserved forever. But most of all, he felt it in the space Jessica had left behind. The noise, the whispers, the judgment, was deafening. But Andrew heard only one thing, the sound of his world falling apart. And he was alone in the rubble. The cold evening air wrapped around Jessica as she stepped out of the church, her heels brushing softly against the stone steps. The sky, now dimming into the muted hues of twilight, seemed to hold its breath. The distant hum of the city softened beneath the canopy of gathering stars. The sounds of the shattered ceremony, gasps, whispers, and the dull roar of scandal had faded behind her, muffled by the heavy oak doors that now stood closed. She felt their weight like a barrier between two worlds, the one she had left behind and the uncertain expanse ahead. Her body ached, not from exertion, but from the tension that had gripped her every muscle since the moment she heard Andrew's voice through that door. Her hands, now empty, tingled from where her bouquet had fallen, abandoned like the life they were meant to symbolize. She felt hollow, scraped raw, and yet, beneath it all, there was something else. A strange, trembling lightness, as though the ground beneath her had fractured, and she was weightless, standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. Footsteps approached from behind, measured and familiar. Monica. Jessica didn't turn immediately, but she felt her cousin's presence, solid, warm, and unyielding as ever. Monica didn't speak, not at first. Instead, she stepped beside Jessica, folding her arms against the chill as they stood together, gazing at the empty parking lot where the first cars had already begun to pull away. The ceremony was over, though not in the way anyone had expected. Finally, Monica broke the silence. "Well," she said, her voice soft but edged with that unmistakable wryness Jessica knew so well, "that was one hell of a wedding." Jessica's breath hitched, a sharp, broken sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Some party," she replied, her voice rough and unfamiliar in her throat. "Just no groom and no reception." She glanced down, her fingers brushing against the satin folds of her gown. "Do you think they'll still charge me for the catering?" Monica gave a soft huff of amusement. "If they do, I'll make them regret it. But you know," she added, her voice dropping into something gentler, "I think you gave everyone a show they'll never forget. And I'd say you came out of it with something a hell of a lot more valuable than a champagne toast." Jessica's throat tightened. She felt it then, the sting behind her eyes, the weight of everything that had been holding her together finally beginning to crack. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Did I, though?" Monica turned fully to face her, and Jessica felt her cousin's hand, warm and steady, cover her own. "Yes," Monica said firmly, "you did. You walked away from someone who didn't deserve you. You chose yourself, Jess, and that's everything." The first tear slipped free, warm against the chill on her cheek, and Jessica's voice broke with it. "It doesn't feel like everything," she whispered. "It just feels empty." Monica's grip tightened. "That's because right now it is. You had something you thought was real, and it wasn't. And losing that—" She paused, her voice softening further. "It hurts. But empty doesn't mean broken. It means there's room now for something better." Jessica's chest heaved once, and then the dam broke. The tears came hot and hard, and she turned, collapsing into Monica's arms as the weight of everything crashed down. The betrayal, the loss, the humiliation, the grief for a love that had never truly existed. Monica held her without a word, one hand cradling her head, the other steady against her back, and let her break. There were no platitudes, no rushed comforts, only presence, solid, grounding, and real. The sound of approaching footsteps broke through the haze of her sobs. Jessica pulled back slightly, her vision blurred with tears, to see her parents standing a few steps away. Her mother, Florence, her face etched with sorrow and pride, and her father, James, his hands clenched but his eyes soft with something raw and unspoken. "Sweetheart," Florence's voice trembled, and in 2 steps she was there, pulling Jessica into her embrace. "My girl," she whispered into her hair, her own tears warm against Jessica's cheek. "You are so brave." Jessica clung to her mother, the familiar scent of home, jasmine and something warm and worn, flooding through her, unraveling her further. "I'm sorry," she choked, the words tumbling out in a broken rush. I wanted today to be perfect. I wanted—" Her father's voice, deep and rough with emotion, cut through softly. "Jess," he said, and when she turned to him his eyes shone, steady and unbreakable. "You gave us something better than a wedding. You showed us your strength." Jessica's lip trembled. I feel like I've lost everything." James reached out, his broad, calloused hand, the hand that had built their life from the ground up, cupped her cheek. "No," he said, his voice firm with certainty. "You lost a lie. You kept everything that matters. You kept you. And that's something no one can ever take." The sob that broke from her then was sharp and soul deep, but as her parents closed their arms around her, it began to shift. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was something else, something cracked and battered but whole. A sound behind them, hesitant but familiar, made her lift her head. When she turned, she found Diane, Andrew's mother, standing a few steps away. The older woman's face was pale, drawn tight with something that flickered between shame and sorrow. For a moment, the two women stood in a silence too heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, Diane's voice, brittle and low, broke through. "Jessica," she said, her lips thin, her tone careful and stripped of its usual sharpness. I don't expect you to care what I think, but you deserved better, and She hesitated as though the words cost her something. "I'm sorry for what my son has done and for what I didn't see." Jessica, her voice hollow but steady, replied simply, "I didn't need you to see. He did." Diane's mouth tightened, and for a fleeting second, something like regret flickered in her eyes. She gave a stiff nod, then turned, walking away with the brittle poise of a woman who had lost something she couldn't name until it was gone. The air shifted with her departure, leaving a silence that felt at once lighter and heavier. Jessica's body sagged, the exhaustion, physical, emotional, soul-deep, finally taken its toll. She felt Monica's hand slip into hers once more. "Come on," Monica said softly, her voice warm and full of something that felt like home. "Let's get you out of this dress." Jessica gave a broken, breathless laugh, the absurdity of it cutting through the raw ache in her chest. "God, yes, please." They began to move, her parents beside her, Monica's arm steady around her waist, and as they did, Jessica felt it, subtle but certain the weight hadn't lifted. It was still there, grief, anger, and loss, but it was no longer crushing her. It was something she carried. And with each step, it grew a little less sharp, a little more bearable. She didn't know what came next. Tomorrow felt like a question without an answer. But for the first time since the world had shattered, she felt something small, fragile but alive inside her chest. A flicker. Not of happiness. Not yet. But of hope. The morning light streamed softly through the windows, brushing the room with a gentle, golden hue. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, blending with the subtle freshness of spring that crept in through the open window. The faint hum of the city beyond was distant, softened by the cocoon of the small, warmly lit apartment. Jessica sat at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug, its warmth seeping into her palms. She watched the slow swirl of cream in her coffee, her gaze distant, her thoughts layered and tangled like threads waiting to be unraveled. A week had passed since the wedding that wasn't. 7 days felt both like a lifetime and a single breath. The chaos of that day, the confrontation, the fall, the eyes of hundreds on her, had settled into something quieter. But it had left behind a different kind of noise, one that lived beneath her skin. There had been headlines, of course. Social media had flared briefly with the scandal, with whispers and comments from those who had attended. But the furor had passed quicker than she expected. People always chased the next spectacle. For Jessica, though, the echoes remained, deep and personal, and no passing news cycle could drown them out. Her phone, lying face down on the table, buzzed softly. She didn't reach for it. Messages had been constant. Friends offering support, family checking in, reporters fishing for a statement. She had answered when it felt right and ignored what didn't, but today felt different. Today, the world outside the walls of her apartment felt quieter, and she wasn't entirely sure how she felt about that. A knock at the door drew her from her thoughts. She rose, the floor cool beneath her bare feet, and opened it to find Monica leaning casually against the frame, holding a paper bag and a familiar smirk. "Thought you could use some real coffee and a muffin, because I know," she teased lightly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, "that whatever sad brew you're drinking is an insult to caffeine." Jessica's lips curved in a faint smile, the first one in what felt like days. "You're not wrong," she replied, closing the door behind her, "but I'm not sure coffee's going to fix this." Monica set the bag down on the counter and turned, folding her arms. "No," she said softly, her teasing edge slipping into something warmer. "But it's a start." Jessica sighed, leaning against the counter. "I thought I'd feel different after everything. I thought I'd feel relieved or proud, but mostly I just feel tired." Monica's eyes softened. "Of course you do. You didn't just walk out of a wedding, Jess. You walked out of a lie. And that kind of thing, it takes more out of you than people realize." Jessica looked down at her hands, her thumb tracing a line along the mug's rim. "I keep replaying it. Everything. What he said. What I said. And I know I did the right thing. But part of me—" She paused, her voice tightening. "Part of me feels like I lost something, even if it wasn't real." Monica stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "You did lose something. You lost the future you thought you had. And grieving that, it's not weakness, it's human." Jessica's throat thickened, and she looked away for a moment, trying to find her voice. "I don't miss him," she said, her voice soft but certain. "But I miss what I thought we were, what I thought we could be." Monica's hand touched her arm, grounding her. "That's the hardest part," she said gently. "Losing the dream." The room fell into a brief, companionable silence, filled only by the soft hum of the city beyond the glass. Jessica felt the knot in her chest loosen, just slightly, under the weight of Monica's understanding. She didn't need to be told that she would heal. She needed to be told that it was okay not to be healed yet. After a moment, Monica's eyes glinted with familiar mischief. "But," she added, "the upside is you absolutely destroyed him. I mean, poetic justice? 10 out of 10. A laugh, real and unguarded, bubbled from Jessica's lips, startling her with its warmth. "God," she said, shaking her head, "you're terrible." "Terrible," Monica agreed with a grin, "but effective." Laughter faded into something softer, but its warmth lingered. Jessica felt it. A shift, slight but real. The ache hadn't vanished, but it felt less sharp, as though, piece by piece, it was making room for something else. The day passed slowly but peacefully. Jessica found herself sifting through emails, making plans to return to work, something that felt daunting but necessary. She had spent days hiding from the world, but now something in her itched to step back into it, not as the woman who had been left standing at the altar, but as the woman who had chosen to walk away from it. As the sky outside deepened to soft twilight, her phone buzzed again. This time she glanced at the screen. It was her mother. Without hesitation, she answered. "Hi, Mama." Florence's voice, warm and gentle, filled her ear. "Hello, sweetheart. Just checking in." Jessica's chest softened at the familiar care woven into every syllable. "I'm okay," she said, and for the first time it felt true. "Tired, but okay." A soft pause. "I've been thinking," Florence said carefully. "We were going to have a celebration today, for a wedding. But what if we still did? Not for what didn't happen, but for you, for standing in your truth, for your beginning, not your ending." Jessica's eyes stung, but she smiled. "A party for my survival?" Her mother's voice was warm with laughter. "A party for your strength." Jessica's throat thickened, but this time with something brighter than sorrow. "I'd like that," she whispered. After they hung up, Jessica stood by the window, the night sky spreading wide and limitless above the city. The pain was still there, a dull ache beneath her ribs, but she felt something else too, the edges of it softening. The first fragile threads of something new. Hope wasn't loud. It wasn't a sudden burst of joy or a sweeping relief. It was a quiet, persistent thing, a whisper that grew stronger in the spaces left by heartbreak. Tomorrow would come, and the day after, and she would face them, not as the woman who had been abandoned, but as the woman who had chosen herself. The future, her future, stretched out before her, uncharted and unknown. And for the first time, she didn't fear it. She welcomed it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful narratives and unforgettable journeys. Share this video with your friends to spread the message, and check out our other videos for more captivating stories. See you in the next one.